now correlate the two kind of national, domestic issues aspects and the international ones. And ultimately evaluate the findings. In other words, all of the policy issues we discussed matter as much as the analysis of them, right? Not simply the facts, here you go. This is why the final exam has an evaluative component as well. It gives you an opportunity to actually kind of be the judge of what's happening. So your evaluation matters, your comments mattered, you saw that we had extensive discussions, and ultimately my hope is that you will continue to pursue international security as a field in one capacity or another, because guess what, there is only, and that's a very pessimistic perspective of the world, that's the disclaimer, there's only one thing that's permanent in international relations, and that's conflict and security threats. So for all the wrong reasons, people make a career out of that, right? Whether teaching at a university level, working in the policy community, but you'll always have something to deal with in terms of policy challenges. So again, hopefully we've together been able to achieve these learning outcomes. The most important thing for me as a professor of international security is to give you the practical knowledge on all of these topics. Again, I'm unfortunately not able to develop each of these topics extensively because we only have 14 weeks together, but I wanted to make sure that you have that background knowledge and the practical tools and skills to evaluate these very practical security issues that, for those of you who will be working in the policy community one way or another, will be dealing with directly on a daily basis. And the worst thing of all of this is that all of these security issues are overlapping with each other. They're happening simultaneously, so how do you devote attention to all of these at the same time, right? So my hope is that you'll be able to take all of this knowledge and skills out of this classroom and continue with your individual career paths, because these are important skills: the ability to write a policy brief, the ability to write a good short analytical essay, the ability to articulate analysis verbally. If you ever decide to work in government, this is going to be kind of your purpose for being there, especially at the early stages when your boss comes in and says, you know what, we want to hear a 15-minute brief verbally on the following policy issue. Go. Guess what you have to do? Do it, right? So that's why these types of seminars are so important. They're very, very practical skills. As I mentioned, I'm teaching Political Science 1080, Comparative Politics and Foreign Policy. Next semester, I'd be absolutely delighted to see either one or all of you in my class. It'll be of a similar practical application. Theory only matters as much as its application. That's why I started with theory and am not going to finish with theory, right? So again, hopefully we've been able to achieve this purpose as well. Again, my last practical point to you, please apply to internships, please apply to internships. As well as studying, it's important to further your career if you choose to go down the route of this field. Internships, I am exhibit A of that, are the window into a policy career, whether it's then transforming into academic career or you decide to stay in the policy career, whether it's on a domestic front or on an international scale. But internships is the gateway to all of these career-long opportunities. So please take a look at the list of opportunities that I sent you earlier in the term. Apply to one, ideally apply to all of them, okay? And I'm happy to endorse you in your applications in one capacity or another, okay? If you'd like to chat with me about any of those individual opportunities, I'm happy to meet with you, truly, okay? So use this database, and I will somehow find a way to update this on a regular basis, even when you're not students of mine. But there should be a website that I'm creating where I will update the different policy community opportunities. Okay, so take a look at these. Some of these are for US nationals, but most of them are not, if that's a concern for you. Any questions about this? Again, I can't stress enough, if you're looking for work in the policy community, this is one of the best ways in the contemporary job market. Okay? Practical enough of a point? Good. Very good. Okay, so let's talk content, right? Because we need, for the next 40 minutes, 45 minutes, to talk about content. I'd like to make sure that I address all of the possible topics, especially from the first half of the course. Why? Because we've covered the second half of the course more recently, and some of these points that may linger in your mind because we've already done a midterm on them, we should go back to them. However, very important, I'd like to ask for your input on what would you like for me to cover. Again, this is incredibly important. Guide me, guide each other. What would you like to cover? Again, it's not just about the first half of the course. If there's a specific topic or concept that you'd like for me to cover in the latter half, I'm happy to do that. Okay? So, this is our trial and error review for the final exam. What would you like for me to cover? Everything. Excellent. That's a good start. So I'll start with week 1 on what is security and walk from there. Anything a little more specific potentially? Yes, Paul.
Can you do the intelligence cycle and its interaction with the policymaking cycle?
Yes, absolutely. So make sure to remind me of that when I cover the intelligence cycle. Just say, how does that relate to the policy of the cycle? So I have a slide or a couple of slides on that. Excellent. Anything else?
Topics in the final exam questions.
Excellent. I can't give you the topics specifically because this will be a randomized sample of questions out of a potential pool of questions that I put together a while ago. So everything is fair game, right? Which is why I gave you Thursday. You committed to me for that 1.5 hours of studying for the final exam. So don't forget that, yes.
Yeah, could you enlighten more on policy making?
Policy making?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Policy making, so the policy cycle?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 2 for policy cycle, excellent. Please remind me when I do the intelligence cycle, I'll relate those 2 together. Anything else? Paul?
Just 2 more.
Yeah.
Can you go over the steps of active measures and
Yes.
then the different types of intelligence?
Different types of intelligence. Okay. Active measures, I have a slide in there. Let's relate it to the policy and intelligence cycle discussion. Okay? Yes, Naima.
About like the reasons for like acquisition in the Arctic, and particularly like reasons of why the northern route is more like important or like beneficial.
And then the Suez Canal.
Yeah.
Okay. Could you remind me of that towards the end of the? Okay. So at approximately when it's 10 past, just remind me. Okay. So I leave time for that. Okay. So tasks for all of you who want to intervene. Yes.
Could we go over the components of a crisis?
Absolutely, and I have that in the slides, and we'll also talk about groupthink. Okay. One last one, because there's a lot to cover. I promise. I have a lot of slides. Yes.
It was about the graph, like when the policies are being
Policy
made.
punctuation.
Yes.
Okay. So towards the end at 5 past. Okay. Could you remind me? Thank you. Okay. Let's begin. So there's a lot to cover. Please look through all of these slides and readings for all of the weeks. I double, triple, quadruple checked. Everything is up there. Please study. Please. What are you supposed to do? Study. Okay, let's talk about the initial concepts that underpin everything that we've done in the course. What is security? We talk a lot. We talked 14 weeks of security. What is security, Josh?
Well, I guess just to get it started, it could be, you could define it as like a positive or negative type. So
Exactly.
You could have like the absence of a threat could be one type of definition, or you could just have like, I don't remember if it was analytical or what the positive exact.
They're
definition
frames
is.
associated with security. Excellent. So I have a couple of slides on that. Because there's a delineation, right, between positive and negative security, and then we have the analytical frame and the normative frame. Yes.
Is it like a action of like protecting social norms of a sort of state?
So there's a component to some sort of status quo, yes.
Under the analytical frame, isn't negative security the absence of threat, and then the positive security, like security plus, where you're allowed to thrive?
So let's start with the very basics. most commonly is through the alleviation of threat to cherished values. So this is where the values come in, right? So ultimately, we know under securitization theory that there is no such thing as a natural security threat. Everything is framed. That's an important component. So it's a threat to values. In other words, things that we have established for ourselves as our baseline. So ultimately, there's another perspective that it's not just the ability to guarantee survival, right, the basic physical survival, but it's about the ability to pursue political and social ambitions, which brings us to, as Josh said, the security plus component, right? So two ways of looking at it. One is there's the pure physical survival, and then the other one is also the ability to, let's say, determine your political future and your actions and things like that. So some sort of agency, that's important, right? The ability to pursue what you want. 4 spheres of security, what are they? Yes?
You're gonna have military, political, societal, and environmental.
Environmental. And we placed economic under what?
Political.
Under political, right? So the field can delineate between economic security, but if you look at the literature, it's generally in pursuit of political goals. That's why we put it under there. So again, we have military security, so concern about defense and offense from a purely military perspective, so everything in terms of the questions of deterrence, when we talk about NATO, right? In terms of defensive capacity, in terms of Russia, offensive capacity, China, gray zone conflict, even if there's a military component to it, it's still within the military security sphere. Political security, this is where we put economics as well, right? Economic security for the purpose of political security. Focus on organizational capacity of states, ideologies that give legitimacy. For example, during the Cold War, communism gave legitimacy to the Soviet regime, capitalism gave legitimacy to the US-centric world, right? So that's part of political security, the ability to maintain capacity. So if you remember in basics of international relations, what is a state? One of the key components is the ability to exercise monopoly on violence within a given territory, right? That's also part of political security, so the capacity to actually enforce these types of aspects. So economic security we placed under the political subcategory. Societal security that focuses on the nation more than the state, right? So on the community of people within the borders, less about the security of the state itself. The idea that the security of the state is paramount is called what? Yes? Statism, right? So the survival of the state is paramount. Often it's been attributed to people of the realist perspective, right? Where states play the core role in international affairs. So of course you want to preserve that ability to conduct your politics through the state apparatus. So that's why statism is a perspective on not just security, but international affairs in general. Yes.
Would you say that sovereignty is an extension of the state's monopoly on violence? In
Yes.
a given area, that's what sovereignty is?
Sovereignty, from a security perspective, again, how you determine security will determine how you look at sovereignty. Is it just the basic survival of the state? Statism? Then you have sovereignty congruent with that perspective. Others who say security plus will say it's not just about the survival of the state, but the ability of the state to conduct foreign policy the way it wants, right? So it depends
Beyond its area.
beyond its area and just in general have agency, right? So security could be survival or survival plus agency, okay? Excellent question. And please keep those coming. Securitization theory, again, the idea that there is no such thing as a natural security threat. Everything's framed, and we know how it's framed because we've discussed securitization theory together, with its multiple components. So, when we're talking about security policy, it's a deliberate choice to address certain challenges through a security lens, or a securitized lens. In other words, subnational, national, and international communities, whether it's individual communities, or jurisdictions within states, or the state apparatus, or the international policy community, for example, the United Nations Security Council, which is a multi-national endeavor. all of these, across these levels, they choose deliberately to address certain challenges through a security lens. This is where securitization theory comes in. We have visualized it together, right? We have an external environment conducive for securitization. Could be policy punctuations, right? Where you have periods of stasis or very little change, and then abrupt change. So this external security environment can be characterized by terrorist attacks, 9/11. That was a punctuation that then facilitated a whole range of choices, deliberate choices that were meant, successfully, unsuccessfully, that's a whole different conversation, but policy choices that were meant to address the security concerns, right? The major restructuring of the US security apparatus, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security out of all of these different agencies, the mobilization of different security structures, the change in the budgets, right? Budgets expanded exponentially as soon as these types of issues were created. Again, we have two components within that, securitizing action, right? So the deliberate articulation or framing of a policy challenge as a security threat. Right? So it's a deliberate action by the political establishment, either the executive branch or the leader, whoever it is within the state apparatus, as well as the acceptance of the audience. So when we're talking about securitization, we're talking about role theory. Essentially, you have someone who articulates a security or a challenge as a security threat, and there has to be an audience to accept it. But what kind of regime would this require for this to be true? A democracy, right? This, if you have circles, and this was in your midterm, you have circles that are the same size, this is going to be equal responsibility between the enactor and the acceptor, right? In a less liberal or the more illiberal regime a regime becomes, this can stay the same or increase in size, but it's still going to be larger than the blue circle because the level of acceptance isn't as much of a requirement. Yes?
So is the regime type considered part of the external environment?
The external environment is simply the regime type is not part of the external environment. The external environment is the independent action that's taken place outside of that regime. So again, a terrorist attack or some sort of war that breaks out, right? That's independent of the regime type.
So it has to be kind of, like you say, independent, so doesn't,
Right. So again, to manipulate the size of these circles is essentially congruent with the manipulation of the type of regime inside. The external environment, again, terrorist attacks can happen in liberal, illiberal regimes, right? So there's some sort of external environment. And then when you manipulate the sizes of the circles inside, you manipulate a type of regime. Okay? Let's move forward. So, coming back to the analytical versus normative frame of security. So analytical frame is associated with which school? Come back to it. Yes,
The Welsh School.
Welsh school. And the normative frame is the Copenhagen school. So if we look at these, Copenhagen school is associated with the normative frame and the Welsh school is associated with the analytical frame. When we're talking about normative frame, it's essentially good, bad security, right? Normative statements, this is good, this is bad. Analytical frame is the one that's associated with security plus, the idea that there's survival, let's say of the state, of the individual, and in order for security to be completed, there has to be security plus, also agency, the ability to pursue goals and have the ability to act the way that that entity wants. Ultimately, the Copenhagen School is concerned with all of these ideas that are also associated with groupthink, right? The logic of necessity, the window of opportunity, we have to act now or things will get out of control. So there's a level of stress and crisis decision making that's associated with it. Narrowing of choices, because we know that crisis decision making generally reduces the number of choices that you can make. Because you're compelled to act, you have to act now before something gets out of control. So in general, the Copenhagen school, or the normative frame of security, or the normative school, generally prefer desecuritizing issues. That would be the default choice, because then all of these issues such as logic of necessity, window of opportunity, and the stress and the crisis decision making that's associated with it, as well as the narrowing of choices, simply will not be applicable. As soon as you use desecuritized issues. So keep that dichotomy in mind, okay? Because these are on two different sides of the debate. And again, there are benefits and drawbacks of each. So, core assumption of realism. What is the core assumption regarding human nature?
Human nature is based on, I guess, it's kind of evil.
Yeah.
Or in essence, like in the state of nature, one is only
Yes.
protected by the Leviathan.
Yeah. Well, as you've seen over the last 14 weeks, we're just awful people. You know, doing uncontrollable things in the middle of international security. We're just awful, right? According to realists. I don't think so. I think we're lovely people, right? But if we left the world to the anarchic environment, according to Thomas Hobbes, we will have a continuous state of conflict, and by implication, a continuous state of security threat, right? Thomas Hobbes talks about this idea of common power to fear, right? That society is in the state of nature is an awful community, and what's going to remedy this? A Leviathan, right? A Leviathan in the sense that an entity that could enforce. It doesn't have to be an individual, it could be a group of people, it could be but it has to be some sort of entity to remedy this seemingly awful state of nature, okay? So, therein, we have multiple types of power and tools of influence in this horrible anarchic state of nature. There are parts of resource-based measurement, right? And resource-based measurement can give us hard power, the ability to influence an outcome based on military coercion and economic coercion, or soft power, or sharp power, right? Sharp power is much more subdued, which is associated with phenomena such as active measures. But soft power generally, when we're talking about this, it's political influence, right? The ability to conduct information campaigns, so propaganda, and of course diplomacy. And in fact, earlier today at 6:30 in the morning, I committed to writing a paper with a good co-author on the weaponization of diplomacy. So, soft power, diplomacy will play a key role in that. So, again, it's a question of the ability to measure. Hard power is much easier to measure because you can look at the specific military capacity, economic coercion capacity that's based on much more tangible, measurable resources, or soft power, which is difficult to measure, because how do you know how much political influence a country has, at least in the concrete sense, right? We know that it might have a lot. We know the US has a lot of political influence internationally, but how do you measure that? What are the indicators? What are the different aspects that you would have to look at? It's difficult. So, mitigation of the security dilemma. What is the security dilemma? It's a dilemma of security, I promise. Yes.
The dilemma is that the more you securitize things, the more like, I don't say instability, but the more there are chances for things to go wrong with that securitization. It kind of will backfire.
So, almost, but very, very close. It's not necessarily linked to securitization, it's linked to the amount of power that you're displaying. Or for example, when we're talking in the material sense, let's say, Russia, NATO, and the Baltic states, right? The more military hardware each side puts on the different sides of the border, it doesn't make them any more secure, does it? Right? They feel much more threatened. So the more application of, or display of power you have, the dilemma, or the paradox, is that you're actually feeling less secure. Okay? So, how do you mitigate that? Well, there are a number of aspects that we discussed together. Democratic peace theory, which in other words, regime type matters, that democracy and democratic peace theory stipulates that it's not that democracies are generally more peaceful than autocracies, but they don't fight each other. Okay? Democracies intervene and they engage in wars. They're not any more peaceful in general. They just don't fight each other, it seems, these democracies. Yes?
Do autocracies fight each other?
They do. They do. They do. Okay? Yes?
So the security dilemma is more like a creation of this perception of the more you put into the security, you'll perceive that you're actually less secure.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, precisely. Yes?
But do autocracies fight each other as much as democracies fight each other, or more?
More.
Oh,
So democracies don't generally fight each other. They fight autocracies. And autocracies generally fight each other and democracies in an equal propensity.
thank you.
But again, it doesn't mean that democracies are generally more peaceful. They just don't fight each other. Yes?
So constructivism is kind of a counter to realism.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So anarchy is in the eyes of the beholder, so that we actually have to have an anarchic world. There are a lot of things like international law, international organizations that can actually mitigate the state of nature as well. Not necessarily a Leviathan that's going to come in. Again, it's a question of perception. Okay, so these are the three mitigations of the security dilemma. So, let's shift our attention to privatization of security functions. What does privatization of security functions mean? Yes.
Basically, you're gonna outsource it to some other non-government entity, and it could conduct acts on your behalf.
Right.
Provides like masking.
Anybody else would like to add to it? No? So, ultimately outsourcing what we consider to be traditional government functions to either non-state actors, generally non-state actors, or some sort of removed entity. So isn't exactly it. In our context, specifically, we discussed PMCs, right? Private military companies, private military corporations, and we looked at a number of cases, you remember, that they are not functioning perfectly. They're not a fine-tuned instrument of, security application. So why do we privatize if there are such imperfect entities who, yes?
Political face saving.
Political face saving? What does that mean?
Well, the little green man, if they do something good, you can always say, oh, it's just the little green man, it's not me.
Right. Yes, Josh?
Save yourself some money.
Save yourself some cash. That's good. Devin?
Well, then, so one attribution challenge that can be brought back to you, but also, if the soldiers end up dying, it's not your soldiers.
Exactly, right? You're not responsible for those coffins that are returning, right? You don't have to be responsible to the parents, right, of the soldier, their family, right? You don't have to pay compensations, right? Military compensation is a thing under international law and domestic law. You can avoid a lot of that. So, attribution challenge, a number of you have mentioned it. They're not our people. I have no idea. Some uprising over there. You deal with it, right? This is great. So, political face saving, which is essentially, you're much less accountable for the death of mercenaries or your soldiers on the ground, right? Oh, there's some, mercenaries that, you know, freedom fighters that I have no idea who they are. They just came out of the blue and so on and so forth. I'm not paying these people. I'm not paying these people. This is a purely inter-ethnic situation. I have nothing to do with this, right? And the cost saving. In the material sense, it's much cheaper in every aspect to hire a mercenary than your own soldier. Again, not necessarily just equipment. There are a lot of costs associated with sending a soldier, right? You have to provide, if something happens to them, you have to provide them, even if they don't necessarily pass away on the battlefield and they simply are injured, you have to pay them for the rest of their life. So sending soldiers is expensive. Mercenaries, not so much. Decision making in crises. What is the foreign policy crisis? Crisis. Yes.
It is an issue that is all encompassing, and you're not able to move past it. Like it causes deadlock.
You can ignore a crisis, but should you? What are the three components? Yes.
One of them is a temporal component.
Exactly.
It has to be a reasonable suspicion that something's going to happen in the immediate term, and you only have a short amount of time to act on.
So window of opportunity logic is imposed, right? You have to act now, or the situation might get really out of hand. Yes.
You said the situation getting out of hand, that if you don't act, it'll just get worse.
Right. So finite time to respond. You have to respond forcefully. Yes.
I was gonna say, kind of what she said, that there's a likelihood that if you don't act, it will get worse.
Right.
So there's a high likelihood of that.
Exactly. So it's a circumstance where you have a threat to one or more basic values, a finite time for response, and a heightened probability of hostilities. By definition, a crisis in international affairs or a security challenge, you have some sort of hostility going on. So you've identified most of them, right? But again, the basic one is that you have to have hostility. If there's no hostility, it's not really a security challenge, is there? So, threat to basic values. Why is it a threat to basic values? Because all challenges are deliberately securitized. Nothing is inherently a security risk, unless we frame it as such. So, a finite time to response, it's called also a window of opportunity logic. We talked about groupthink, which is a phenomenon that we examined in the context of whom? Yes?
The Bay of Pigs invasion.
Bay of Pigs invasion, as you remember. Go back and read through the case study. Groupthink is a phenomenon where you have people simply confirming what the leader of the group says. Again, because they're acting under these circumstances, right? So you have a narrowing of the potential options, you have a finite time to respond, and you have to respond to that rather forcefully. So, groupthink has its limitations, but also benefits, right? You can have a very speedy decision-making process, but the drawback is you may not look at all the potential options, therefore you may make bad decisions in the long run. Yes, Blake?
Interesting, kind of thinking about groupthink, is I was having a discussion with one of my mentors, and we were talking about Kennedy's cabinet and how he was known for bringing, the kind of the best and brightest and
Yes.
searching out. But in fact, that almost kind of what we discussed in class, that almost led to the even greater chances of groupthink, because they were known for being the best and brightest.
Yeah.
And that kind of reinforced how could we be wrong.
Exactly. Precisely. So, intelligence cycle and how it relates to the policy cycle, right? So that's one of the things that I was asked to address specifically. So, in the intelligence cycle, first, the guiding principle is that we have to have a mission, why we're actually doing what we're doing in terms of the intelligence operations. We have the planning and direction stage, and generally that's set alongside the requirement for agenda setting, right? So we have an agenda that requires for us to actually conduct some sort of intelligence operation. The collection stage, so you can have a collection of different types of intelligence, right? So we have SIGINT and then any of the other ones, right? Signal intelligence, human intelligence, geospatial intelligence, and so on and so forth. So then you have to process that intelligence to fit the policy conduct, right? So analysis of the problems option, design and intervention. So at any point, what you're producing in the intelligence cycle, or at the end of the intelligence cycle, dissemination, integration, this is still going to affect any of the potential components of the policy cycle, because whatever you produce could impact the agenda setting, right? The agenda will be set based on the information that you receive. In other words, this is a challenge, this is not a challenge, and how you can do that is by looking at the intelligence. Intelligence can also fit into the policy cycle through design and operational plan, right? How you're going to approach a policy challenge can be determined by the information that you receive from your intelligence apparatus. Same thing for evaluations. Whether you conducted a good policy or not can be dependent on the intelligence that you receive, right? But ultimately, the strongest point of contact, again, is that dissemination and integration stage. So this is where the policy cycle directly meets the intelligence cycle. Because ultimately what policy, again, to move away from the theory part in the practical sense, policymakers want to see, and I can account for that personally, policymakers want to see processed intelligence with a nice summary page that's no longer than 350 words. Okay? So that dissemination is where it directly meets the policy cycle. Again, it can meet also at the level of the mission, because the mission is determined by the policy priorities. It's not that the intelligence community sets the agenda for the policymakers, it's the policymakers who set the agenda for the intelligence community. This is, by the way, where we have civilian control over the security apparatus as well. Because the intelligence cycle can also not just be part of the civilian intelligence community, but the military intelligence community, right? So we want to make sure that the mission is guided by the agenda of the policy community, not the other way around. Yes?
There's something I've been thinking about, like let's say the whole of our class,
Yes.
we are police makers. So I being police makers and we don't have any information on intelligence gathering, which means, or the way I think, we have to rely on external information we receive from either FBI or
Yes.
other security agents which were deployed.
Yes.
So what happens to that information we receive with the police makers when we are trying to come up with a policy which will serve the whole nation?
It's a big question. I mean, if we remember back to the question of U.S. intervention in Iraq, remember the famous quote that we will guide, essentially saying we will guide the intelligence that we need to see in order to make that political decision regardless. So it depends on how the policymakers decide to interact with that dissemination integration stage. Again, you can have evaluation and feedback. That might be a good thing or it might be a malignant thing, depends on whether the policymaker says, okay, you policy community or intelligence community, chop, produce the intelligence that we need you to produce in order to back up our policy choice. As if that never happened, right? Never happened in Iraq, right? Look back at the case study, right? Come on, intelligence folks, let's do this. So again, dissemination integration can happen differently. It's a choice of the policymakers in a good objective civilian control environment, right? Not subjective one, but an objective one. The civilians are guiding the mission and they're providing the evaluation and feedback for the intelligence cycle to continue to operate like a well-oiled machine. Yes.
So does it go the other way around, like ever? Does the intelligence community at any point just could gather intelligence without any specific agenda and then give it to the policymakers?
Well, there's usually an agenda, right? So that's the mission in this case.
It just
again, the assumption, of course, again, this is a model that assumes a fully democratic, objective civilian control kind of model, right? So there's an assumption embedded, and you correctly identify that it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So any questions here before I proceed to, there were a number of other things that I'm supposed to cover. Northern Sea Route, okay. So civil-military relations, very quickly. Civil-military relations refers to that interaction between the military apparatus and the civilian policymaking apparatus, and the idea, of course, in the democracies to have objective civilian control. Civilian control of the military is one of the prerequisites in a democracy, and not the other way around, because then we have a junta, right? Accountability is incredibly important, right? So the military is accountable to the civilians, not the other way around. Professionalism. Professionalism is that high level of military culture and agenda that is only pointed to defense of the country with no political agenda in mind, right? That's, as soon as the political environment, because I have to move quickly with this. So the military cannot affect the political environment. That's the idea, right? So they maintain separate cultures that are not overlapping with one another. Political neutrality, that's very important. So the military cannot provide political solutions at all. Again, ideally in an environment where you have objective civilian control. So objective civilian control is the desired outcome if we're to maintain a democracy. In other words, the absence of convergence, and then you have subjective civilian control where you have the politicization of the military. And the military then can also impact, because it's been politicized, the policy cycle, right? So as soon as you have a regime where the military is an arm of the party, a red army and its multiple iterations across the world, that's by definition subjective civilian control. North Korea, former Soviet Union, the People's Liberation Army, embedded in the name, right? It's not an arm of the state, it's the arm of the political apparatus. Samuel Huntington warned against that subjective civilian control because then you have a declining efficiency in the military because of that loss of professionalism in the military structures. So, we talked about this. Gray zone conflict. Gray zone conflict. Format of conflict between war and peace. Who sponsors? Generally states, large major powers in the world. How do non-state actors fit into this? Well, they often become the arms of the state, right? They're the ones who are actually delivering state policy. Active measures, I was asked about. Active measures, who asked me about active measures? Active measures. Ultimately, this is a product of the Soviet school of foreign policy. You have this idea of subversion through active measures, and you have 4 steps. Again, we don't know how effective they have been throughout history. You have demoralization, which ideally is the first step, which is a degradation of moral fiber of society, right? So you're trying to infuse information that essentially makes people not believe what they see anymore. Then you have destabilization, so you're trying to put a wedge in between the trust, the societal trust between the government and the population. We've never seen distrust in government ever, ever. Right? And then you have a crisis. So you're trying to destabilize the society on the basis of that rift that's been created. Then hopefully the one who's actually applying subversion will then be able to influence that new equilibrium or normality in terms of the social contract. This we've heard from Yuri Bezmenov from 1985, who gave an interview to the Canadian CBC network talking about all of this because he was a journalist under the cover of the Committee of State Security of the Soviet Union. And you can actually watch the interview with Bezmenov on YouTube. It's publicly available. I encourage you to do that if you're interested. So, we compared regime types and engagement in gray zone conflict. Liberal regimes and illiberal regimes have different types of performance in both because they have different abilities to control their information environment. The information environment here in the US is much freer than in China. China can much more easily mobilize its information space towards what it wants. It can send propaganda internationally more easily, can send propaganda towards its own population much more easily, right? Something that the United States cannot do at that level. So please take a look at this list of comparisons. The readings are incredibly informative as well in that. So, next week we have an exam. Let me go over the Northern Sea Route, then provide an example, verbally provide an example of what the question could look like. So, the Northern Sea Route, what was the question specifically?
Generally, why is it like, why is it more favorable than the Suez Canal? type?
Yes. So, the conservative estimate is that you're going to save at least $300,000 per shipment, which is a significant amount of money, and that estimate is probably 10 years old at this point, and that's within the conditions that were opening up at the time. So very likely, again, depending on the cost of fuel and other considerations, the cost of security, and it's much more beneficial to go through the Northern Sea Route. Shorter distances, fewer security risks. Now we know that, and if you probably saw the news, there are ships now being attacked off the coast of Yemen, right? That's the Suez Canal route. Something that you're not going to encounter, at least as we're sitting here today, going through the Northern Sea route. So you can forego all of these issues, right? Yes.
Is there also a benefit of, I think you said like keeping, because Russia could have a leverage.
Certainly.
But also like as, countries that are using the Northern
Yes.
Sea route, they could also keep Russia accountable as regards.
Yeah. So it also goes back to the question, if we're going to rely on Russia for repair of ships, energy and fuel, and going through its internal waters, is it a route for us to fix our relationship with Russia, or for Russia to fix its relationship with us, right? So, yes, Russia is going to be the main actor in this endeavor if we decide to pursue it from an economic perspective, okay? And again, it's going to impact indigenous populations, but at the same time, maybe that's a route for indigenous peoples to also gain some monetary benefits. Yes.
I think also one thing to consider with the North Sea route is that the ships that pass through there, as soon as traffic increases, there's a lot more chances for pollution and environmental factors that will also affect the Arctic.
Yeah. So all of that, again, you're the future policymakers. You'll have to decide on that cost-benefit analysis. Right? There's a lot of benefit. There's a lot of benefit, but there are also severe costs. If we care about the environment, and that's our paramount idea that this is what we're trying to preserve, then the Northern Sea Route is going to have very significant impacts on global environmental sustainability in all respects, from environmental degradation to pollution to emissions to increasing the greenhouse effect, right? All of these things are going to be an issue. So cost benefit, again, there's no perfect answer. If there was a perfect answer, our policy will look rather different. Does that answer? Excellent. Anything else? Okay, so examples of questions that I could pose to you in the second section. How does China impact international security? It's a very broad question, but this is the scale of question that I could ask you. Maybe not in the first bank, but in the second bank of questions. For example, how do active measures compare, or how do active measures, it's out of the bank of questions, you will not see these questions, but I thought about them. How do active measures facilitate illiberal's regime to conduct gray zone operations? How does objective civilian control help democracies conduct efficient foreign policy? Those types of questions. They can be broad, they can be specific in terms of concept. Again, there's going to be a mix of questions that are case-focused. How does China impact international security? Or I can ask you about how does the realist school see the following? Okay, and then you'll have to explain. Yes?
I know you can't give us like the specific banks, but like, is Like, is there differences between the types of questions? that
Yes, there
asked
are.
in each bank?
There are. So the first bank is going to focus on the first half of the course, and the last two will focus on the latter two. Okay?
You have to choose one from each bank.
One from each bank. Please do not choose more than one. First, you have a time limit. Please don't do more than you have to. That goes for most jobs out there. No, do well. But please pick one, right, from each bank of questions. I'll make sure that that's embedded in the assignment requirements. And you are responsible for 3 long answers. Okay? 40 multiple choice, you're responsible for all of them. Don't pick the first 5 and then just, don't do that.
This is a breeze.
If you're finished with the exam in 20 minutes, there's a challenge. I promise you. I promise you. Yes. Any
Yeah.
final questions? Yes.
Yeah, now, when I was trying to read the USA foreign policy
Yes.
towards our international security subject,
Yes.
I noticed we have doctrines or ideology.
Yes.
It's like the US has the setup ideology of people we follow, like the John Jay, those people. To which I started thinking, now if I come up with a thought of changing our policy,
Yes.
like you and I, the whole class, we decide, no, the USA foreign policy has got loopholes.
Yes.
We want to fill them up.
Yes.
How will we do that yet? Most of these ideologies,
Yes.
they have to be followed. It's like you cannot work beyond or against
Yes.
them.
Well,
It's a must, you have to follow them.
the answer is work for the State Department, rise through the ranks, and affect policy. No, I'm serious. This is how you do it. You engage with the policy community. You become a well-published, well-respected academic in your field that's going to be hired as a consultant by governments. I do that once in a while, right? There are many ways to affect policy directly. I worked with the European Commission and I was able to sit down with 26 diplomats and tell them that maybe you should do the following. So there are many ways. Work for the State Department, find those internships. Even if you work for the RAND Corporation, if you work for the Atlantic Council, you will be directly writing to the policy community. Right? There are many ways to directly affect these, and one can say, well, this is really like a far-fetched thing. No, you can directly affect policy, and you should. And you should, okay? It's been an absolute pleasure, okay? I hope to see all of you around campus or in one of my future classes. And I have to say, and it's probably not according to party line, but it's probably been one of the more enjoyable classes that I've had the pleasure of teaching here at Webster. So the discussion has been excellent, and it's lovely to see all. Yes?
I have 2 questions. Do we take attendance? Do you take attendance?
Yes, I should take attendance.
And the 2% grade, will that be
Yes,
added?
I'm going to send out a note, or I can verbally say it and send you a note. Could you send me a quick email through Canvas if you've been to the lecture and you wrote the assignment, just so I can cross-reference, because I have multiple sources. Just send me a quick note on Canvas so that can be streamlined. That will be applied after your final exam, okay? So before you walk into the final exam, you will have a grade for all of the other components. That's my commitment to you. And then you'll know how well you have to do on the final exam to get the desired grade you may earn, okay? Does that answer the question? Just make sure as soon as possible send me an email, because I don't want to miss the students who should get the 2%. Yes?
Will you upload these slides?
They're already up there.
They are.
They're already up there. So you have everything that you could possibly need. And the most important thing, study. Please study. Okay? I even gave you Thursday, so you. Okay. Good luck. You got this. Study
class.
individually, study together.
Class, before you leave, is it possible on Thursday to schedule, we come and meet here, then we do kind of debate discussion in that 1 hour?
Democracy, let it reign.
Yes, that's why I've asked if it's possible.
It's fine with me.
Hmm?
Yeah, I'm good with it.
So 7 o'clock?
Yes.
I will message Pat if I can make it, or make an announcement.
Okay? I want to give you as much agency as you need to study for this exam. Please keep in mind there's a lot of material. Okay? So organize yourselves. I strongly encourage you to at least think about working together.
I have to go, I have other things to do, what is it? Oh, I know what you're doing.
Yes, attendance. But I do it from memory. At this point, I think it's a compliment that I can do it from memory.
Thank you.
I'll be here Thursday. I'll be here Thursday.
I will make sure that I have
It's actually on campus,
Most
you
of
may
us
literally.
is how we
Yeah,
understand.
yeah, I just want to make
the
sure that,
subject.
No,
that
you don't
we
owe
have
them.
Your opinion, I have my opinion.
Because I have some
We also have ways we perceive
They should
Spring will
start.
show up afterwards, I don't know if Spring is
subject
here
we
yet,
have
because
covered.
you're
Sometimes
gonna have to
we
stay, or have this here until
we are asking questions.
Paragraph,
Yeah.
I just wanted to say meeting, and I wasn't
The
sure, I
subject
was
what
home
to
before, because I know I turned it in.
So when
I
we
did turn it in that
discuss,
Friday,
we
but I don't know
normally
if I
grab
meant, I didn't know what to say
70%
with the
of
deadline.
what we
I'll see you.
discussed.
Any
Sitting
time on
somewhere,
Anytime on Thursday.
you understand the Yeah?
Okay.
So what day did you say, Tuesday or Thursday?
Thursday.
This Thursday?
Yes, like
Okay.
we use this opportunity, yeah.
We'll come.
Just for group study?
Yeah, we can sit together and then we can go over what we don't understand and we can elaborate with each
Yes.
other.
Hmm?
That's
Like
it.
when I ask the question, you are able to provide your opinion or how you understand it when she asks like that. Hmm? You see how it can help us. Yeah, then you concentrating, you're reading, sometimes you don't understand. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
they're good agencies.
they're really good. I have two of their sources for
Good.
my paper, and I was reading through it, and one of they have a section for the Israel conflict. Like,
Yeah.
what has the U.S. done so far?
Mhm.
And we move carrier groups over
Yeah.
into the Mediterranean.
Yes.
And also, the president issued a warning: don't. Followed shortly by the Secretary of Defense, who reiterated the same message: don't try it.
Yeah,
Which is
Yeah.
the funniest response I've
Yeah.
ever